a moment ago, we introduced our next guest, Greg Jenner, onto the sofa. Morning to you, Greg, author, historian. And jokingly, I said to you, Greg, slightly mistakenly, do you know much about potatoes? And you know a lot about potatoes.
I'm not a spud nerd, but I'm a historian and I know a little bit about the history of potatoes. They're really interesting, yeah.
Fascinating small facts about potatoes that people might not already know.
They were considered to be dangerous. So when they were first brought to Europe in the 1500s, they were thought to cause leprosy and flatulence. And so it wasn't until the late 1700s that people ate them. A Frenchman called Parmentier convinced people to eat them.
What I find interesting is I understand leprosy being, considered to be dangerous, but flatulence.
No one wants flatulence, but
it's not dangerous. Though. It's just a bit unpleasant, isn't it?
Well, maybe, but yeah, the spud was. We tend to think of Walter Raleigh and the potato and all that, but yeah, they weren't really eaten. They were fed to horses.
So
until the late 1700s.
They weren't, and you know what I'm doing here. They weren't around in Egyptian culture. No. Ancient Egyptian culture.
Potatoes are Peruvian. They're from South America, from the Andes. So the Inca had them. They had frozen mash. They would freeze-dry them in the mountains and dig them up 5 years later and eat them. But the potato came to Europe in the 1500s.
This is more like your latest project, isn't it?
Now I'm on safe ground, yeah.
OK. So why the history of Egypt, why concentrate on that now?
So I've written a brand new children's book series, and book one, so the series is called Totally Chaotic History, and book one is about ancient Egypt, and I've co-written it with a brilliant Egyptologist called Dr. Campbell Price, who's at Manchester Museum. He's a curator there. And we're starting with the Egyptians because kids love the Egyptians. They're fascinating. They're amazing. Their civilization lasted 3,200 years, which is an incredible long period of time. And if we did that for our own history, we'd be back in the Iron Age. So it's a huge amount of time. So we tend to talk about the Egyptians as if they were one people, but they were millions of people. And ancient Egypt is so long that Cleopatra, who is at the end of Egyptian history, she's closer to us in time than she was to the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Yeah.
That's how long it was. So she's the last pharaoh, the last of the 170 pharaohs, and the Great Pyramids were built right at the beginning of Egyptian history.
And what we're showing on screen now, these are some of the illustrations for the book.
Yeah, these are illustrations from the book by Rick Parek, who's illustrating all the books in the series. He's very, very funny. He's a brilliant illustrator. So Campbell is the expert on book one. Ricken's doing all the books with me. And these are funny, fact-filled books for kids aged about 8 to 12. And the book is called Totally Chaotic because the idea, it's about explaining to kids that no one knows what's coming next. And we know that because we've lived through some pretty chaotic moments in the past few years. I don't think anyone in 2016 knew what was coming next. So it's about trying to give kids that sense of what it would be like to live through those 3,000 years of history at 100 miles an hour.
So our director, Tim, has just put in my ear, and I was just about to talk about this with you, but he just said, and this is one of the things, from your history lessons what you remember, right? Mm-hmm. And he says one of the things he remembers is that it's about mummification. Yeah. And that you used to pull the brain out through the nose, through a little hook through the nose. Everyone remembers that. Everyone remembers learning that. And so I looked in the book to see how you describe it. You do have a little warning that if you don't like what... These are the things that fascinate children.
They are.
Because you think Egypt, you think mummies.
Is that true?
Why?
It's not always true. So Campbell is at pains to explain to me that not always the brain came out, not always the organs came out. What we think of as standard practice actually isn't standard practice. You have to imagine this population of millions of people, 3,000 years apart. Mummification changed during that time. The technology, the ideas behind it, how they did it. Sometimes the heart stayed in, sometimes the organs stayed in, sometimes they went in canopic jars.
Depended on who they were as well, didn't it?
It was regional too. So the Egyptians, they weren't all the same. There was north and south, there were different cities. So Campbell would love me to state that actually mummification is not a sort of one-size-fits-all. And most of the mummies that you might see in museums, Campbell's exhibition is on for 2 more weeks if you want to go to the Manchester Museum. The mummies you're going to see, they are the elites, they are the rich, they are the important people being mummified with the 70 days of treatment. But ordinary people, they didn't get that treatment. They got a much more simple treatment. So it's really fascinating to do a book for kids where you're kind of myth-busting, where you're taking on these things that we think we know, but actually, that's why we wanted to write these books, is to bring the research up to date.
Do you remember a time, Greg, and I don't know how old you are, when...
41.
OK, very open. Do you remember a time when history was treated, what's the word, very soberly, where the way you approach things would have been seen to be inappropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I work very hard to try and make history for everyone. And sometimes you have to be sober. Sometimes it requires sobriety. Sometimes you've got to be serious because it's a serious subject, and sometimes it's not OK to be doing jokes about things. But for children, certainly, and for adults too, sometimes laughter, using pop culture, using references that we all are familiar with, it can open up the subject and make sure that people are enjoying it and knowing that history is for them, it's for everyone. It's our global story, and our stories come from all over the world. And everything is interconnected. So Egyptian history is interconnected to British history and world history. And so humour and pop culture and having a laugh is part of what I do, because it's about giving kids and grown-ups a way into a subject that they might have found intimidating or scary or daunting or irrelevant and boring, all those words that you sometimes hear. But I think, actually, if you can laugh your way in, then you might be having a nice time.
I want Greg on my pub quiz team. I just feel like I bet you've got a bank of knowledge.
I'm pretty good on history.
Stuff.
I'm rubbish at Coronation Street. I wouldn't be any good on
There's
the
a history
on the
of
soaps.
Coronation Street.
Yeah, everything's
history.
Everything's got a history. Everything's got a history.
Nice to see you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Greg. Greg's book, Totally Chaotic History, Ancient Egypt Gets Unruly, is out now.